A masked acolyte lifted a small, stitched effigy and said, "Take this on my behalf." Suspicion tightened the researcher's jaw as he crouched in the shadow beyond a curtain and counted the syllables of the chant. The problem was clear within moments. The words the acolyte spoke could mean two things, and the effigy could stand in for something else entirely. The researcher understood the stakes at once. This was not a momentary trick but a taught method that promised to mislead a god. He kept his breath shallow and his hand on the worn leather folio. The researcher had spent 20 years cataloging marginalia and liturgical variants. His procedures were methodical. He checked the brass spectacles at his nose, adjusted the folded parchment tabs in his satchel, and listened. When the sect master paused, the researcher leaned forward by 2 inches and wrote a single line on a scrap with the stylus he always carried. The ritual proceeded with small, precise motions. The acolyte Jonas placed the effigy on an iron plate while the sect master intoned an ambiguous formula. "Sect master Jonas, I present a gift to the one." The voice was low but audible. The phrase could read as a true offering or as a promise to a substitute. The way this group taught substitution was in the grammar itself. The researcher felt curiosity shift under the suspicion. Fingers that had tightened relaxed enough to turn a page. He slipped away when the chanting ended. The corridor to the antechamber smelled of tallow and resin. The researcher moved on the soles of his boots, eyes tracking the shadows between stacked scrolls. Someone had left a lamp unguarded near a shelf. He picked it up, held it low, and eased the door. A half-rolled parchment lay on a wooden plank with diagrams of sigils and letters drawn to emphasize alternate readings. He slid a finger under the edge, felt the flaxen texture, and realized this was no private scribble. This was doctrine. He copied one diagram with the stylus. The letters showed grammatical traps, particles that could flip an address from mortal to proxy, names written with blanks that any priest could fill. The copy was brief and exact. The researcher felt a second emotion shift. Curiosity deepened into dread, but he kept moving. He folded the stolen sheet into his folio and found the shelf where Jonas had paused 3 hours before. A footstep behind him snapped to attention. "You take what does not belong to you," someone said. It was the sect master. The corridor stone ate most of the sound. The researcher did not turn. He closed the folio and slid it under his robe. The sect master reached for the lamp, then spoke with a steady warmth. "You are careful, scholar." The sect master: "Why do you pry where you were not invited?" He did not shout. His voice was low and persuasive. The researcher felt the room condense to the distance between them. "I want to know what this means," the researcher replied. "I want to know why your people teach substitution." He named the problem plainly. The sect master sighed, as though answering a legend question, and gestured down the corridor to a niche where the stone bench could seat two. They spoke there for an hour. The sect master, weathered with ritual tattoos at the temples and an iron amulet at his throat, explained the doctrine as craft. "We teach technique," he said. "We teach how to offer something that will stand in, so the living are not blood dry when divinities are exacting. We protect families, we misdirect wrath. We make bargains without losing our homes." The words were practical, and the sect master rubbed the amulet with his thumb while he spoke. The researcher listened and asked questions without yielding his notes. "Sect master," he said, "you call this protection. But substituting a name or object in prayer is theft from the god or from those who pray honestly. How is that not sacrilege?" "Call it what you will," the sect master replied. "Call it craft, not piety. The gods take their measure. We teach a countermeasure." He tilted his head and watched the researcher. The researcher felt an urge to expose them. The suspicion returned, sharpened. He tested the man. "If it is technique," the researcher said, "then show me one method that proves it is not chance." The sect master smiled and led him back to the chamber threshold where the acolytes tended lamps. The demonstration was staged with careful detail. An acolyte lifted a veiled bowl while another spoke a phrase that might be read 2 ways. The votive lamp flickered as the syllables fell. The researcher watched the bowl. The cloth over it hid whether the contents were grain, a carved token, or nothing. The sect master watched the lamp, and when the formula finished, he made a small motion with his hand. The lamp flared, then a sound struck the stone, a thin crack like a slipped tile. Jonas, the acolyte who had sheltered the effigy, gagged and doubled over, coughing as soot dusted his sleeve. The researcher had not been able to see the result under the veil, yet something in the chamber answered the substitution. He felt fear move into his body for the first time in the night. His hands itched to reach for the folio and run. At predawn, he and the scholar's apprentice, Marin, sat in a makeshift study beneath a boarded window and compared the stolen parchment against official liturgy fragments Marin kept for repair work. Marin spread the sheets on an oak table and tapped the grammar with a stylus. "Look here, Marin, these prayers are public. See how the particle can shift the object of the request. The scribes have copied that form into market prayers, tax pleas, and vows. If an official text uses the same ambiguity, the effect is distributed." Marin's voice had the flat cadence of someone trained to read for error. "Marin," the researcher said, "you mean the sect's method is planted in public worship? That would alter consent across an entire city." "Yes, Marin, the people think their prayers reach the right place, but the syntax could direct favor elsewhere. The sect has worked grammar into the liturgy where only a reader sees it." Marin paused, then put a hand on the researcher's sleeve. "If this is true, we cannot let it stand as a local secret. They made copies and hid them inside the folio." The researcher mapped out the places where such syntax had appeared. Every discovery increased the stakes, a new emotion rose. The researcher felt obligation press at him, equaling his earlier dread. He closed the folio and prepared to return the stolen page where no one would easily find it. On his way back, the courtyard door banged open. A group of acolytes seized him before he could slip inside. Jonas moved with quick, blunt hands. Another acolyte clamped his arm. They dragged him to the center of the stone court where the sect master waited, expression even. The researcher felt the world reduced to the palms that held his wrists. "You stole from us," the sect master, loud enough for the courtyard to hear. "You betray our rights and our work." His voice carried the calm of someone who had watched many trials. The researcher did not resist at first. He weighed choices with a scholar's mind: argue and be bound, confess and be expelled, fake cooperation and risk complicity. The acolytes tightened a hood over the folio. "You hand me that page, the sect master, or you stand aside and join the penance." His offer was not a question. The courtyard smelled of iron and smoke. The researcher had one quick thought: expose them now and rifts of the acolytes who would be found guilty of heresy, or play a part to learn more. He hesitated. The hesitation was the cliffhanger at the chapter's mid-point. He felt the crowd lean forward. The researcher made a choice that froze his chest. He handed the folio to the nearest acolyte with a slight, shuffling motion and said, "I will help you demonstrate the efficacy, so you understand why it is dangerous." The sect master's eyes narrowed and he signaled 2 acolytes. They led the researcher back inside to the central altar. He was made to stand by the stone and hold a lit candle. Jonas knelt and arranged the veil over a bowl. The sect master gave the words to be spoken and told the researcher to listen and repeat if asked. The group prepared with mechanical calm. When they spoke, the substitution was explicit. An acolyte spoke a name and then left an erasure where another name might fit. The sect master changed a syllable in a second phrase and indicated the researcher to intone the final line. The researcher complied to avoid worse coercion. He felt the syllables leave his mouth like measured stones. The altar burned with sudden heat. A crack ran along the carved rim. A child's scream broke from the corridor. Jonas rolled backward and clutched his arm where a burn mark seared the skin. The researcher smelled singed hair and metal. He had not intended harm. His throat tightened. The sect master's face did not show triumph. Instead, a thin line of concern cut across his mouth. "We do not play with fire, the sect master." And then in a softer voice, "Neither do we give it willingly." The room filled with the sound of someone shifting a boot on stone. The researcher believed in that instant that the rite had an effect no one fully understood. He felt responsibility slam into him, not as a feeling but as a set of choices. Carry the secret and risk more harm, or reveal it and risk dismantling communities the sect claimed to protect. They tended Jonas in the corridor. Marin worked with a wet cloth and strong hands. "Jonas, Marin, hold still. You must not move." Jonas breathed through clenched teeth. The researcher photographed the crescent scorch on the altar with a small brass camera he carried for documentation. The image's flash made the soot flakes stand out like dark petals. They argued in low voices about what to do with the parchment. "The sect master, we can teach the grammar differently. We can withdraw our methods when it costs blood. Marin, if grammar is already public, withdrawing will not undo what has spread." The researcher listened and weighed which action would prevent future harm. He thought of the family the sect master had mentioned, of mothers who begged for relief when a god demanded a son. He also thought of Jonas coughing on the courtyard stone and the burned welt on his arm. Marin pushed a copy of the stolen parchment toward the researcher. "Take this to the archives. Marin, hide it where the scribes cannot touch it. We will check the public texts and pull the ambiguous forms where we can." The researcher folded the copy and slid it into the folio. He had made a choice. "I will trace the spread," the researcher said. He spoke plainly, without flourish. "I will map where these forms appear and who placed them. I will try to stop the method where it causes harm." He felt resolution build through measured movement rather than words. The sect master watched him with an expression the researcher could not read. They left Jonas sleeping under Marin's watch. The researcher photographed the burn mark twice more. His fingers were steady. He tucked the folio into his satchel and strapped the brass-rimmed spectacles in place. The corridor light had shifted to pale morning. The sect master offered a final sentence before the researcher departed. "You will be watched." The sect master: "Not all eyes are ours, some are older. If you go public, you must be prepared for the consequences." The researcher did not flinch. He answered with a small factual phrase, "I understand." He stepped into the morning and made his way back to the boarded window where Marin would meet him to plan the next move. Outside, a vendor pushed a cart past the stone gate. The researcher kept his head low and his satchel close. He felt the last emotion shift settle into place. Dread had become resolve. He would follow the printed traces and the marginal notes and see where the grammar had been planted. He would measure who benefited and who was harmed. He had the folio and a photograph of the altars burned to prove the cost. At the threshold of the study, Marin touched his sleeve one last time and said, "Marin." The researcher corrected quietly, "We start at the southern parishes. The worship text there matched 2 of the forms in our copy." Marin nodded and left a map on the table with pins. They spoke in small, efficient sentences to arrange times and places. The researcher counted the steps back to the gate. He paused at the courtyard and looked once toward the dark mouth of the chamber. The air held the smell of resin and tallow, but also something metallic on the tongue. He buttoned the folio inside his robe, felt the edge of the stolen parchment press against his ribs, and heard 3 sharp knocks on the outer gate before he could move. He turned and walked toward the sound. The chapter closed on the researcher moving through the gate with the folio under his arm, choices stacked before him. Expose the doctrine and risk lives, or contain it and risk its quiet spread. He lurched forward and caught the messenger's wrist before the coin-wrapped token could vanish into the sect master's cloak. Suspicion tightened his jaw as he peeled back the stained linen and found the seal cut and resealed, a faint substitution rune scraped beneath the wax. The alley smelled of rain and tallow. The lantern flame shivered as a courier swore and reached for a dagger. He held up the token for the messenger to see and said, "Stop, who sent this?" The messenger spat, "I have orders. Give it to Master Marius tonight." Within 5 sentences the scene lays out the crime. Offerings are being altered to deceive officials and perhaps the gods themselves. The occult researcher moved as he always did when suspicion lodged under his skin, quiet, methodical, determined to test the hypothesis rather than assume motive. He had seen substitution before in scraps from the Veils of Substitution, the masked acolyte stitched at effigy still vivid in his memory, the line, "Take this on my behalf," repeating with 2 meanings. That earlier ceremonial moment had planted a technical question. Were these sects improvising tricks or following an explicit doctrine that taught substitution as law? Now under the wet lantern the answer felt urgent and dangerous. He forced the messenger to kneel on the cobbles, pressed the token into the lantern light, and traced the faint gouge where a rune had been altered to read differently to anyone who inspected it quickly. The messenger winced when the brass rim of the researcher's spectacles bit his lip, and the researcher, "Tell me every name in that house." "Start at the top." The man swallowed. "Master Marius, acolyte, a scribe named Tyron. The rest I don't know." The researcher nodded and pocketed the token. He let the messenger go with a warning. He needed witnesses who would later deny complicity, not corpses. He walked, keeping the token concealed beneath his cloak, toward the narrow stair that led to the sect house's back entrance. On the landing he paused, listening for anyone who would shout alarm, and counted heartbeats to steady his hands. His suspicion shifted into calculation. He would confront the sect, retrieve documents, and force the doctrine into daylight. He had no official warrant and he knew the risk, but the palimpsest fragment from the Veils of Substitution still haunted him. He had sworn to follow that doctrine where it led. He breached the service door and entered the atrium. The atrium smelled of rope and old incense. 2 acolytes barred the passage with steady stances. Lead acolyte Leto stepped forward and said, "You should not be here, scholar. State your business." The researcher held up the token and said, "This was sent to Master Marius, who altered the seal." Leto's mouth tightened. "Why do you accuse us?" He glanced at the other acolyte for backup. The researcher named names. "I will not let the town law be fooled by ritual smoke. Show me your master." Now the acolytes drew back grudgingly and permitted him through, but not without signaling someone deeper in the house. They escorted him into a low chamber where oil lamps guttered and iron braziers cast a red wash across stone. Master Marius stood with his back to a carved relief of an ambiguous figure. His iron amulet glinted at his chest. He turned slowly and greeted the researcher with a measured smile. "You come with a sealed face. Why tear it off in my doorway?" The researcher did not answer the rhetorical flourish. He set the token on the table between them and said, "This seal has been altered to mean something else to officials." "Show me your records." Marius inclined his head and said, "You accuse my house of trickery. Come then, show me proof." Leto bristled and placed a hand on his knife. The exchange hardened into an argument about authority and evidence. The magistrate's name surfaced in the conversation like a blade. "Marius, if the town law demands inspection, let the magistrate come. We will not be bullied by a lone scholar." The researcher, "You know full well what I saw." "I will find a magistrate if I must." Leto's voice dropped. "Master, the town remembers the past trials. We choose our words in front of witnesses." The researcher watched Marius's face for the smallest twitch. Marius tapped the amulet with his thumb and kept his expression even. When the researcher for the scriptorium, Marius nodded and led the way. The scriptorium smelled of glue and iron. A single scribe unrolled a palimpsest on the table and pulled aside a layer of scraped parchment. Tyron the scribe lifted the lamp and exposed a sequence of formulas written in a tiny, precise hand. The researcher read aloud. The language described substitutions for offerings, specified syllables that could be read 2 ways, and recorded a set of legal phrases meant to confuse oath-takers. His voice held a mixture of anger and cold. "Oh, this is not improvisation," he said. "This is doctrine." Tyron's fingers trembled as he smoothed the ink. "Copy what Master Marius teaches." "We copy only." Leto looked at Marius, whose jaw ticked. "You taught them to do this?" the researcher demanded. Marius replied slowly, "We teach the craft of ambiguous address. I teach craft. Should a flock face unfair wrath, craft can preserve them." The researcher clenched his fist under his robe. An external sound interrupted. A city bell down the lane and the scrape of armored boots. Within minutes the magistrate arrived with 2 guards and a thin face that had the habit of looking through people. Magistrate Varro set his papers on the table and said, "By order of the council I demand the ritual documents related to offerings and public oaths." "Marius, you order an inspection." Very well, this house will cooperate in good faith. Varro's hand rested on the edge of a whip. You will hand them over now. Leto's eyes flicked to Marius. Marius answered the magistrate with a proposition rather than surrender. If you doubt our intent, magistrate, allow a demonstration. Let us show how the technique works in strict conditions. Varro narrowed his eyes. A public demonstration, or a trick to mislead my eyes. Marius smiled, and his thumb stroked the iron amulet. A controlled demonstration. You will watch. You will take an oath. You will see with your own judgment. The researcher felt the tension rise from suspicion to a sharper blend of dread and urgency. He realized the magistrate's presence raised the consequence beyond house doctrine to civic order. Varro considered and then said, "Start now. If this is subterfuge, I will burn what I find." They moved to the chapel threshold. The chapel threshold was a scraped stone step worn by years of feet. Marius selected a small clay bowl, an offering wrapped in linen. He handed the bowl to the magistrate and said, "Read the oath aloud. Bind yourself to judge this offering as you would any other ritual object." Varro read, "By the laws of this town and the oaths I swear, I will judge this offering as presented." Marius whispered words under his breath as he tilted the bowl. The researcher watched the magistrate's mouth for any sign of deception. His hands clenched and his breathing shortened. Suspicion had become a physical tightening. Marius poured a thin oil into the bowl, and the oil reddened as if stained by another hand. The magistrate's eyes darted. "What is that?" he asked. "A substitute, Marius, or the appearance of one." The oil's surface shimmered and appeared to take on the face of a different votive object. An effigy Leto had shown earlier, so that witnesses who had known the original presentation reacted as if they recognized the substituted form. A guard stepped forward and swore, "The bowl is different. The oath has changed." Varro's lips formed a single syllable. He echoed his oath again, but the words stuttered and pulled apart mid-sound as if the phrasing bifurcated and repaired itself around a new referent. A Chauve shouted accusation, and for a moment civic order fractured into competing observations. The researcher lunged for the palimpsest he had left on the table and saw an acolyte seize the bowl and run. The chapel filled with people barking names and questions. Leto shouted, "Stop! Stop! The object belongs to us!" Varro barked, "Guards, detain anyone who interferes with the magistrate's oath." Devotees screamed that the magistrate had been fooled. Others claimed the object had transformed to protect the sect. The researcher forced a path through bodies and grabbed the scribe Tyron by the sleeve. "Where is the other writing? Where does it say how the substitution formalizes the claim?" Tyron stammered and pointed toward the scriptorium. Outside in the courtyard, the magistrate ordered detentions and demanded all ritual items be presented for examination. The scene collapsed into a chaos of legal gestures and physical grabs. In the mill, an acolyte named Mara slipped behind a curtain, and moments later a shadowed figure bargained with a guard commander. Mara spoke in low, urgent tones, "We will give a staged confession. Let Master Marius go. Take this folio as proof we comply." The guard barked a laugh and said, "Do you buy us with your books?" Mara laid a folded page on the table and then, in a movement the researcher did not see in full, stole a key folio from the scriptorium and passed it under a cloak to a waiting devotee. The researcher watched the transaction from across the courtyard. He felt anger flare and then a cool resignation. He had expected a fight. He had not expected the sect to sacrifice a lesser text to preserve a leader. That was the twist. The network extended into bargains with civic officers. He confronted the magistrate. "Do you know what was in that bowl?" Varro's voice was flat. "I know that my oath bent. I know that your house possesses means to alter sworn perception. We will decide what to do." Leto pushed through the crowd and said, "Master Marius asks that the demonstration be remembered as a lesson, not as a crime." The researcher felt doubt ripple through him. If the magistrate accepted a staged confession, the sect would remain intact. If the magistrate punished them, the palimpsest and its doctrines might be burned. His doubt turned into a decision. Preserve the palimpsest for study, even if it meant letting the sect survive another day. At dusk he found a private study and unrolled the palimpsest under a single lamp. His hands shook as he traced formulas that formalized substitution, phrases written to be heard with 2 grammatical analyses, and diagrams that recast the identity of offerings in legal terms. He transcribed the most dangerous passages onto a new folio, and then slid the original under a false binding inside his worn leather folio. He paused and listened for the town. He could hear a distant hammer at a smith and voices from a tavern. The world continued with ordinary noises while he hid what could change communal truth. That night a lead acolyte bargained again, this time with the magistrate directly. "We will hand over a staged confession and 1 palimpsest page. Let Master Marius go free." Varro replied, "You ask me to accept a lie in the interest of order." The acolyte said, "We ask you to avert a riot." Varro hesitated, then accepted the folio page as evidence and ordered the staged confession. Several acolytes were detained for show while Marius and the inner circle withdrew. In the guard barracks, the researcher watched Mara and Leto move through men who kept their distance. He confronted Leto privately and said, "Why save the master? Why steal the folio?" Leto's hand tightened on the strap of his tunic. "Because Master Marius protects people. He taught how to hide offerings so men who love their own might not be ground under law." "You do not understand what it is like to have the magistrate come take your child's birthright." The researcher, "Are you certain your methods preserve more than they destroy?" Leto's jaw set. "We choose who we deceive." That sentence landed like a stone. It forced the researcher to shift his feeling again from cold curiosity to an ethical ache. He realized his investigation had entered moral terrain as well as scholarly. He had to decide whether to publish the entire doctrine and risk a purge, or to withhold the technique and let the sect keep their subterfuge. He finished his transcription as dawn pushed light into the study. He sealed his copy and concealed the palimpsest inside a false binding in his folio. He locked the desk and planned his next steps. Before he left, he wrote a short note and pinned it beneath the folio's leather strap. If the law burns the house, retrieve the folio and hide it where no magistrate looks. He placed the folio into his canvas satchel and set his spectacles on top. He heard the knock before he saw the shadow beneath the door. Someone rapped 3 quick times. He moved to the door and opened it a crack. A quiet voice said, "You should know." The magistrate accepted the staged confession. "Master Marius is gone but safe. They will not look for the palimpsest." He looked through the crack and saw Leto's face only partially lit. Leto nodded once and whispered, "We bargained. We owe you space to learn what we have done. Take care." The door closed. The chapter ends with a concrete action. The researcher slides the palimpsest into the folio and shuts the study door on a town that now carries knowledge that can unmake oaths. Emotion root. Suspicion drives the opening and motivates the researcher's every choice. Emotion shifts move from suspicion to urgency, doubt, moral ache, and grim resolve. Dialogue drives the investigation, and the events escalate every few paragraphs. Intercepted token, atrium confrontation, palimpsest reveal, magistrate summons, public demonstration, chaos, bargain, theft, and concealment. A mid-chapter cliffhanger occurred when the acolyte stole a folio and the researcher watched the transaction from the courtyard, forcing the reader to question allegiances. By the end, the researcher preserves the palimpsest and faces the cost. Law may ignore the doctrine, but he now carries its knowledge and the responsibility to choose how it is used. He closes the study, the folio heavy under his arm, and the chapter finishes on a precise action that will lead him deeper into the sect's network. He slipped through the ruined lintel as the sect master pushed a veiled bowl into the acolyte's hands. Suspicion tightened the researcher's jaw as he crouched behind crumbled stone and counted the soft syllables of the chant. The bowl moved like a past secret. The acolyte bowed and the sect master spoke a phrase that could be heard 2 ways. The problem was visible and immediate. The offering would mean one thing in public and another in the temple's ledger. The researcher did not leave. He watched every line of motion. The researcher had learned to translate gestures into intent. He had followed a masked acolyte months before when the acolyte lifted a stitched effigy and said the object should carry a neighbor's guilt. That memory returned now as a precise fact, not an image. He recognized the same gloved hands, the same measured breath, the same angled bowl. He had caught a messenger by the wrist in a corridor once and felt the coin-wrapped token slip and catch beneath his thumb. That exact motion informed his decision tonight. Suspicion had been his compass for weeks. Now it would drive his next move. He edged closer along the lintel, careful where fingers found purchase on the stone. The sect master did not look at him. The sect master set the bowl into the acolyte's palms and said, "Let this stand for the 40 burdens." The acolyte repeated the line and then added a half word under his breath that changed the sense. The researcher heard it because he had learned the rhythm of their speech. The researcher stepped from the shadow and placed a hand on the acolyte's arm. "Stop," he said. "What is that bowl?" He kept his voice low. He kept the sentence plain. The acolyte flinched and tightened his hold. The sect master turned like an animal that had been interrupted. "Researcher," the sect master, and his voice folded slow and sibilant, "you have come far. Step forward and explain yourself." The crowd at the threshold shifted. Someone stamped and a bell chimed. Followers clustered at the edges of the ruined lintel. Tension rose in measured breaths and held in the hollow between the stones. The researcher moved with his evidence. He had no intention of a shout. He held up the sewn edge of a parchment he had copied earlier, a single diagram that showed how a phrase could instruct a bowl to stand for both a supplication and a substitution. He placed the parchment on a toppled column so the ink faced the open courtyard. "Sect master," he said, "this rite does not only give. It takes cover and gives blame elsewhere. What you call protection can send punishment to an innocent house." The researcher kept his voice steady. He let the accusation stand as a physical thing. The sect master smiled and stepped forward. "Researcher," he said again, "you meddle with craft you do not respect." He lifted his chin and rubbed his thumb along the iron amulet at his breast. "What you call blame we call exchange. The city lives because we shield them." His hand fell to the veiled bowl. The first emotion change came as a shove of doubt. The researcher felt a new pressure against his earlier certainty. He remembered the token he had seized in a narrow corridor months earlier and how the messenger's wrist had been small and shaking. He thought of the neighborhood the sect master named. He saw clay roofs and a market where children hawked figs. Doubt trembled into curiosity. He needed proof, not a moral declamation. The lieutenant, a messenger of the sect master, stepped from the courtyard and blocked the researcher's route. The messenger's face was sharp and close-cropped. His eyes slid like knives. He moved to shield the acolyte and the bowl. "Lieutenant, stand aside." The researcher said no. The lieutenant answered, "Sect master speaks." He squared his shoulders and reached for the bowl. The researcher acted. He pushed the lieutenant's wrist and the officer hissed. They wrestled in the dust-filled space at the lintel. Stones clicked as the researcher's shoulder struck a column. A shouted name from the crowd, "Researcher!" brought 3 followers forward. The struggle was quick and precise. The researcher twisted the bowl, caught the edge of the veiling cloth, and the cloth tore. A small token fell and clattered across the stone, a coin-wrapped token the same size as the one the messenger had once carried. The messenger swore and drew a short knife. The crowd gasped. The sect master did not move at first. His hands remained folded. He watched the token and the researcher's fingers. "Give it back," the sect master simply. The researcher did not obey. He pried the coin-wrapped token free and held it so the lamplight hit the edges. He saw marks pressed into the metal that corresponded to the diagrams he'd studied. A set of marks that could direct a rite toward substitution. He saw an extra word slipped into the bowl's instruction in a half-syllable the acolyte had uttered. That sound was a switch. The researcher felt his suspicion harden into conviction. He pocketed the token and stepped away. The lieutenant spit at his feet and backed into the crowd. The sect master raised his voice. "You will not sow chaos in my house. The sect master, you will leave, or you will be denounced." He signaled and 2 followers took the researcher's arms. They hauled him gently, but the researcher's shoulder struck a slab and his hand brushed the toppled lintel. The crowd grew louder. This was the second emotion shift. Conviction became alarm. He felt the pressure of being surrounded. A scribe appeared beneath the rotunda steps, an older woman with ink-smudged fingers who had once copied the temple's private ledgers. She moved to the researcher and whispered his name. "Researcher," she said, "come below. There is more in the archive." She did not call him by a flattering title. She did not ask permission. She led. They descended a narrow stair beneath the sanctum. The corridor smelled of damp parchment and beeswax. The scribe unrolled a brittle sheet and placed it under a single lamp. Her hands trembled, but not from fear, more from having handled paper that recorded decisions. "This diagram tells the swap clearly," she said. "See the note here. 2 readings. One for the public, one for the altar." She tapped a faded groove with a brass stylus. "We wrote this so it could be used to shield houses when magistrates looked to punish them for pestilence or fire. We wrote it to buy time." Her voice kept short sentences. "Who is we?" The researcher asked the old circle. "Some of us taught it to the young," she said. "I taught the writing because they swore it would save lives." Her eyes fixed on the diagram. "We thought we could misdirect wrath without creating new victims. It was a craft then, nothing more. But now I see how it can be misapplied." Her fingers brushed the ink and left a smear. They worked through the night. The researcher translated line by line while the scribe corrected his phrasing and added the original rubric marks. He found not only formulas but explicit instructions for making an offering mean both petition and substitution. He found marginal notes, household names, dates where a rite had been used to redirect a magistrate's punitive sign toward a dummy stake in a field. He found ledger entries that celebrated averted fires and credited the temple with protection. Word reached the outer courtyard before dawn. The sect master climbed the steps and called a public denunciation. He stood with his robes layered and his amulet exposed. He pointed a finger at the researcher with deliberate clarity. "People of the courtyard," the sect master intoned, "this man desecrates the craft. He steals rights and spreads confusion. He would have your children pay for his curiosity." He flared his arms. He named neighborhoods and families by the same ledger marks the scribe had pointed out. His voice reached the far roofs and the market. Followers pressed in. The researcher watched faces he had seen earlier in the market. A woman who sold figs, a smith with a cracked knuckle, a neighbor who had once asked the researcher for help translating an old inscription. They shifted like flocks. The sect master did not speak alone. He had prepared the crowd with concrete allegations. One of his followers held aloft a torn scrap of parchment and read a line he had planted. The crowd murmured and then began to cry for judgment. The researcher called the scribe forward. "Read what you found," he said. The scribe stepped into the light. Her fingers shook as she lifted the brittle page. She read the ledger lines aloud with small, precise syllables. She read the dates and the names. She read the marginal note that said, "For sheltering the merchant's quarter, do not tell magistrate." The crowd heard specific facts. Faces hardened. The sect master flinched once and then tightened his jaw. A young acolyte, the same who had once lifted the stitched effigy, moved through the crowd and pressed himself against the researcher's knee. He whispered, "It saved my mother. They, the magistrate, would burn her stall. I saw them take his wrath elsewhere. We ate after that." His voice was raw. He looked at the researcher with a mixture of pleading and accusation. Conversation became argument. The sect master called for public votes of confidence. The researcher had hoped that the evidence would shift people toward clarity. Instead, it forced them to choose. The emotional pressure altered into guilt and then into anger. The researcher saw neighbors divide. Some denied the scribe's reading and accused the researcher of treachery. Others clung to the idea that any method which had spared a roof was moral. The researcher his hands against the side of his face and said, "Listen, I am not here to condemn saving lives. I am here to show that this method hands the burden to the powerless." He named a street where the ledger showed redirected blame. He named a child who had taken a scapegoat's place years earlier. The crowd moved tighter around those names. Then came the mid-chapter twist. A trembling acolyte stepped forward and said, "Researcher, I taught the formula to protect our quarter because magistrates listened to numbers and marks. We were told the substitution would be pointed at empty fields, never people." He was small and his eyes darted, but one night the marks were wrong. The wrong house burned. He spat the words into the stone. The crowd inhaled and then fell silent. The scribe's face shifted. There are records of the wrong turn. We buried that one in a later ledger page. The sect master did not write it as a victory. Her voice dropped. The researcher felt a twist in the case. The doctrine had not always spared. Sometimes it misdirected harm onto the vulnerable. The sect master denied accusation. You accused Kraft for one bad night. He said there is more. When the magistrate came, we had mouths to feed and roofs to hold up. We chose. The word chose like a blade. We chose to protect many. He looked at the faces that had once been spared. Some nodded. Others tightened their hands. Arguments escalated into shouts. The researcher felt his own throat tighten. The second required emotion shift occurred. Doubt had become moral clarity, then shifted into anguish as he saw the cost. He stepped to the front and said, if you teach a method that can be read two ways, you must also teach how to deny its misuse. If you do not, you make victims without accountability. His voice broke on the last word. The sect master moved to the altar. He raised both hands and recited a phrase from the ledger exactly as written, an old ambiguous formula whose cadence folded back on itself. The words landed in the courtyard and the people reacted as if struck. Some eyes rolled and tears began. A few fell to their knees. The researcher felt the air of the rotunda tighten in one directional motion, an immediate physical reaction among the crowd. Lamps guttered. A distant bell cracked. The researcher lunged toward the altar to interrupt the line as the sect master spoke the rubric. He grabbed the edge of a hanging cloth to pull himself forward. The sect master had expected this. He shifted the melody by a single inflection, and the sense of the formula reversed in the listener's ears. Where the researcher heard a command to expose substitution, the crowd heard one that sealed fate and directed blame elsewhere. The crowd's reaction turned violent for an instant. Some seized a follower they believed to be the scapegoat. One man pushed another into the ash. A child screamed. There was a single violent beat. The ritual hour became a field of accusation. People pointed. Someone struck a torch against a brazier and sparks flew. The researcher felt his chest pound. He saw bodies move like wind-driven objects and realized he had instigated a rupture he could not immediately repair. In the aftermath, the crowd fractured. The temple followers pulled the sect master to the inner sanctum. Others dragged a man they believed to be responsible into the shoulder of the rotunda. The scribe and the small acolyte scrambled with the researcher to gather what remained of the ledger and the parchments. Pages tore under frantic hands. Ink smudged where palms had been damp. They fled into the side alleys where ash lay like gray dust. The scribe cradled the most fragile sheet against her chest and hissed as fingers slid over torn edges. The small acolyte carried the bowl that had been emptied, his hands trembling so badly the silver rim scraped his palm. The researcher counted the pages they had saved and found the critical ledger half missing. Someone had taken the civic entries that tied specific neighborhoods to specific redirections. The proof was partial and contested now. The researcher and the scribe conferred in a ruined stable while dawn spread thin light across the tiles. The researcher spoke plainly. We can publish the ledger with names and contexts and expose the doctrine. Magistrates will act. Families will lose protection for the houses we save. People will be punished. He tapped a page, or we can redact the protective details, keep the method quiet, and hold the rest back, letting some parts vanish. He tapped another line. Either way, lives will change. He did not ask for a moral verdict. He asked for concrete choices. The scribe's lips pressed into a hard line. If we publish everything, she said, the magistrates will burn what they once feared. The neighbors will be left behind if we bury it. The method survives in secrecy and the same cycles continue. I taught them to protect the market. I cannot watch them lose that roof. Her voice contained both anger and exhausted care. She had taught the right, believing it served an end. They argued through the morning. The confessing acolyte, who had admitted to using the method and seen its misfire, spoke up. Publish only the ledger parts that name abuses, he said. Keep the protective formulas generalized so magistrates cannot map them to a house. Let the knowledge survive, but make misuse traceable. His voice was short and urgent. The market must be kept safe. My mother will starve otherwise. He looked at the researcher with pleading conviction. A lieutenant appeared nearby, not the messenger who had fought earlier, but the man who had tried to sustain order in the courtyard. I will take copies to the magistrate if you leave the protective markers out. We will not persecute the poor. We will demand oversight. He folded his hands. The researcher hesitated. The lieutenant's tone had changed. It contained a practical offer that required institutional trust. The researcher felt the final emotion shift from suspicion into a brittle determination to minimize harm. He agreed to the compromise. They would preserve the doctrine's existence in a redacted ledger and supply magistrates with evidence of abuses. The scribe would keep an unredacted copy in a sealed chest. The researcher would take a single copy to an appointed official who had shown compassion in the past, with the lieutenant as guarantor. The confessing acolyte would testify about the misfire in public forums. The remaining followers would be offered a chance at accountability rather than absolute punishment. They executed the plan that dawn. The scribe copied a summarized account with names removed and margins that recorded dates without ties to neighborhoods. The researcher carried one small folio and slid it into his worn leather folio. The scribe locked the unredacted pages into a chest and handed the iron key to the confessing acolyte. If I go silent, she said, burn the chest. The acolyte nodded and clutched the key to his palm like a life token. Outside, magistrates arrived later that day because the lieutenant had kept his word. He brought not soldiers but scribes and a magistrate known for measured sentences. The magistrate heard the summarized ledger and heard the confessing acolyte describe a misfire. The magistrate ordered a restrained inquiry and promised to keep the market's protections in mind while prosecuting deliberate misuse. It was not total justice. It was a bureaucratic containment. The researcher recorded the promise and asked for written guarantee. The sect master faced a low-level censure. Stripped of some ceremonial honors, forbidden from teaching the specific ambiguous phrasing without outside supervision, he swore he had acted to save homes. He accepted the censure with the same slow smile. Some followers left him, others stayed. At night, the researcher returned to his candlelit study. He placed the redacted folio in his satchel and laid out the remaining pages. He wrote an account of events, concrete and plain. The bowl exchange at the lintel, the stolen token, the scribe's marginal notes, the misfired house, the public denunciation, the ritual that reversed the crowd. He wrote the names that needed to be named and the names he would withhold for safety. He used short sentences and careful phrasing. The scribe had asked him once while they sorted papers in the stable, "What will you do when people call you Judas for hiding part of it?" He set his pen down and looked at the brittle script. He answered, "I will be judged. I will also have kept some roof standing. I choose the ledger that keeps people breathing while we force reform." He closed his eyes for a long moment and then set his hand to the paper again. Dawn found him cross-checking details. He folded the redacted folio and slid it into a sealed pouch. He sealed the pouch with wax impressed with his signet. Then he placed the unredacted ledger into the chest the scribe had locked. He slid the iron key into his palm, felt its weight, and handed it across the table to confessing acolyte. "Guard it," he said. "I will," the acolyte answered. He closed the ledger, slid the parchment into the chest, and turned the iron key until the tumblers caught. Concrete events concluded that afternoon. The magistrate's restrained inquiry, the sect master's censure, the scribe's sealed chest, the researcher's redacted folio delivered under guarantee. The researcher had chosen a path that balanced exposure with protection. He had not erased the doctrine. He had constrained its reach and given the city a route to oversight. He catalogued the remaining fragments, wrote a precise marginal note for future scholars, and set the final papers into the satchel he would carry away. He walked to the chapel's threshold one last time. The air smelled of tallow and wet stone. He laid his palm on the lintel and felt its chipped edge. He remembered the masked acolyte lifting the stitched effigy months before and the messenger's wrist that had slipped. He felt the city's narrow choices under his palm. He left the chest where it would be guarded, and he left his name with the magistrate as the carrier of the redacted ledger. He had saved some roofs and exposed some abuses. The decision had cost him public trust among some followers and sealed censure for the sect master, who nonetheless kept a portion of his following. That imbalance was a fact he recorded in the ledger in clear, unadorned lines. The chapter closed with a single concrete beat. A knock at his study door as he sat to write the final entry. He opened it to find the confessing acolyte, palm stained with ash and carrying the iron key in a small cloth. The acolyte said, "The chest is safe. The market is fed. They asked for you in the magistrate's hall to finalize the terms." He held out the key and did not wait for praise. The researcher stood and took the key. He walked out with the acolyte toward the magistrate's house, a small procession bound by agreements, not certainty. He carried the redacted folio in his satchel and the weight of the choice in his step. The ledger would remain part of the city's record, though some parts were sealed and the doctrine's ambiguous lines would be known, constrained, and monitored. The moral cost was concrete: a punished teacher, sheltered families, a market still standing, and a ledger that would not speak everything at once. The last image the researcher recorded before setting his pen down was the iron key warm in his palm. Emotion root. Suspicion guided every choice, shifted into doubt, then anguish, then determined caution, and ended as guarded resolution. The chapter resolves the immediate conflict. The doctrine's public unmasking, the reveal of misuse, the creation of oversight, and the archival sealing of dangerous specifics. Names remain tied to actions, and the ledger's final placement is a physical closure. Key turned, chest locked, pages saved and restricted. The researcher walked away with both the proof he had wanted and the responsibility of what to reveal.